In preparing today's video, I had a hard time thinking of a possible title because I'm trying to tie a few different ideas together. So a couple possible titles, and I'm not sure at this moment which one you will have clicked on, would be Knowledge for Its Own Sake, that would be one title, and Finding Meaning in Grad School. And the way these two are tied together, maybe it's somewhat paradoxical, but I think that a lot of people struggle to find meaning in grad school, and perhaps part of the solution could be in a different approach to how and why we as grad students are approaching the pursuit of new knowledge. So let me start with that as the problem of grad school. So it does seem to me, in my observation, when I was a grad student and later as a postdoc working with grad students, that depression is unfortunately very common. So part of the problem, I think, is that as students focus on a tiny, smaller and smaller part of a subset of a subset of a subset of a field of knowledge, they they lose sight of a bigger picture. They see only this tiny bit of knowledge that they're trying to work on, and they can't put it into a larger context. And this is especially true, I think, at the PhD level and among those who are doing research as opposed to say, taking master's courses. So those who are trying to advance our knowledge. And one of the types of encouragement you might get, if you're in that state, from people who are not in grad school or have never gone through it, is this idea that, well, this must be valuable. Pursuing knowledge is valuable in and of itself. This is a sort of ideal that many people still hold, and yet it doesn't feel true when you're in grad school working on these things. And so this idea just feels old fashioned. But let's use that as a possible segue here. That if it's old fashioned, well, let's look at some old books. And so, one book I want to talk about today that goes into some relevant ideas is called The Idea of a University. And this was written in 1852 by a Catholic theologian. And his work was partly motivated by the Pope having commissioned at that time for a Catholic university to be built in Ireland. So he took that opportunity to ask some of these fundamental questions. What is a university? What is it for? What are its aims? And of course, some of his ideas are no longer what we see as the purpose of a university, but some of his ideas I think that we've lost, maybe we should regain. And in that discussion, he distinguishes two kinds of knowledge and tries to make an argument for which kind of knowledge is the primary focus of a university. So, on the one hand, we have useful knowledge. So, this would be knowledge, especially in the professional vocations like engineering, medicine, law, these kinds of things that have direct, obvious uses for a profession immediately upon graduation. Then you have what he calls liberal knowledge. And this is the kind of knowledge that is knowledge for its own sake. This is the kind of knowledge that, when pursued and when attained, is supposed to gain some some sort of liberation, hence liberal, for the person who's learned it. And so, again, his main point is that liberal knowledge should be the main pursuit of a university. And perhaps this is still maintained in institutions that we would call liberal arts colleges. But in main universities where we have our departments of engineering and law and all these things, and humanities as well, but even in those humanities, I think we have come to see useful knowledge as being the end of the university. So, again, to summarize a key point of John Henry Newman, I'll read this quote here, which is: cultivation of the intellect is an end distinct and sufficient in itself, and so far as words go, it is an enlargement or illumination. So he's using these metaphors of space and of sight to indicate that there's a kind of knowledge that expands you and expands what you can see and what you can understand, and that has value in and of itself. Contrast that then, he quotes and tries to argue against an idea of John Locke, which is more in keeping with our modern view of the university. And John Locke says, and this is now quoting a quote within the book: when a university has been doing useless things for a long time, it appears at first degrading to them to be useful. And I'll pause there for a sec, because this cynicism that's in this sarcastic statement is definitely something we see today. And how many of us have had a notion or heard of some study that seemed like absolute nonsense, like total fluff. And we certainly have a notion that there's a lot of useless things that go on within the walls of a university. And part of that's justified, and part of it is just cynicism. But let me continue. So John Locke continues with, and yet, what other measure is there of dignity in intellectual labor but usefulness? Looking always to real utility as our guide, we should see a studious and inquisitive mind arranging the productions of nature, investigating the qualities of bodies, or mastering the difficulties of learned languages. We have this notion of utility being the guiding principle, and certainly thinking about how many things have changed from 1852 till now, that focus on utility can't, the impact of that can't be understated. Our lives have become increasingly way more comfortable, way healthier, let's say way better in many ways because of this focus on utility, which has lent progress in technology. So we can't argue too strongly against him. But let's go back to John Henry Newman's ideas and see if maybe going too far in Locke's direction has consequences. So going back to John Henry Newman, he's talking about the need not necessarily to focus in your studies on one single study only. So if we are only focused on utility, then of course division of labor is what we're all about, even in the intellectual domain. And therefore don't waste your time learning in other fields. Just learn your field very, very well. But there are consequences. So here's a quote again from John Henry Newman. He says, "The drift and meaning of a branch of knowledge varies with the company in which it is introduced to the student. If his reading is confined simply to one subject, however such division of labor may favor the advancement of a particular subject, certainly it has a tendency to contract the mind." So this hyper-specialization may have the consequence of advancing certain fields faster, to a point, and we'll get back to that, but it also has a negative impact, or could, on the person who is pursuing it. So it is reducing your view of the world as I've described. And that's going to have an emotional impact as well. And here's a follow-up quote, again from Newman. "You hear of practiced travelers when they first come into a place, mounting some high hill or church tower by way of reconnoitering, that is, familiarizing oneself, its neighborhood. In like manner, you must be above your knowledge, not under it, or it will oppress you, and the more you have of it, the greater will be the load." Now you can see here I've put in bold this last part because even though this was written 170 years ago, this seems to summarize exactly what I'm talking about very, very well with the state of grad students. Is you have students who are learning many, many things, but the more they learn, the more they seem to be oppressed by what they've learned. And his insight here is that the reason for that is that they are under their knowledge, not above it. They have not placed it in a larger context, and therefore that knowledge presses on them like a weight rather than feeling as though it gives them greater capabilities in the world. It just feels like a weight to be borne. So to expand your mind and to grow intellectually and to really feel like you are growing as a person, the command here would be to expand your studies. So let's continue on there. I'll read a couple more quotes about the importance of studying in multiple domains. So Newman says here, "The sciences have multiplied bearings one on another, and an eternal empathy, and admit or rather demand comparison and adjustment. They complete, correct, and balance each other. There is no science but tells a different tale when viewed as a portion of the whole, from what it is likely to suggest when taken by itself, without the safeguard of others." Now this is really interesting because he uses the word safeguard here, and he does go on in more detail about this, that there's a hazard again in focusing only on one subject, that you in some sense misunderstand the subject. You may know a lot of true things about the subject, and yet by not having placed it in a broader context, you may make mistakes. You may make mistakes in your own field, or you may make mistakes in other parts of your life where you are perhaps applying logic that is relevant to your field in fields where it doesn't really apply. And so if you challenge yourself in multiple domains, your thinking becomes more complete and in some sense then more true. And a key claim underlying all of this about the inevitability, perhaps, of that feeling of oppression if you don't get above your knowledge but remain under it. The key claim is that the human mind has a nature, and its nature is such that it is seeking to make a unified view of the world. And when you fail to do that, but just keep piling information into it, you end up feeling a sort of anxiety as you have a backlog of information that must be assimilated, and yet you are not doing so. And on the other hand, when you do manage to do so, here's another good quote. Newman says, "Possessed of this real illumination, the mind never views any part of knowledge without recollecting that it is but a part. It makes everything in some sort lead to everything else. It would communicate the image of the whole to every separate portion, till that whole becomes in imagination like a spirit, everywhere pervading and penetrating its component parts and giving them one definite meaning." And he continues again. He says, "A habit of mind is formed, which lasts through life, of which the attributes are freedom, equitableness, calmness, moderation, and wisdom, or what I have ventured to call a philosophical habit." And again, here we highlight this paradox that you can pursue knowledge for its own sake, but that knowledge, of course, will have effects. So you might say that you're pursuing them for the effects, or you might say that the knowledge and the effect in some sense are inseparable. But this gets into, this isn't really the main point. We could argue about that, but the point is about what should we be doing in university. So let's get back to that. And I think in the sorts of institutions we have now where you have engineering departments, for example, we can't go wholesale to John Henry Newman's view that the purpose is the pursuit of liberal knowledge. Certainly these departments, at the very least, their main purpose is the dissemination of useful knowledge. But from his insights and from our observation that currently there is a problem, maybe we can see that we've gone too far to the John Locke's side of things, to the useful knowledge, and that we need to sprinkle in some pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, so that we're not just producing knowledge that is useful to others, but that is actually going to be fulfilling and enriching for the person who's learning it. So if we sprinkle in some other wider learning, and I would not advocate that this means universities should start demanding engineers take fluff courses, but rather I would say that this comes down to student initiative. So I'll place this challenge to you if you're a grad student. Go out, especially if you feel like you are suffering that sort of depression from this hyper focus on your tiny little topic. Rather than doubling down and putting more hours in, hoping that that's going to create more progress, maybe take a step back. Challenge yourself in some other intellectual domain. And it could have nothing to do with your main topic. The only criterion is that it must feel meaningful to you. And see what happens, right? I mean, maybe Newman is wrong. Maybe none of this makes any sense. Just because it was written in an old book doesn't make it true. But treat it like a hypothesis. Do it and see what happens. Go learn something else and see if your main project, your actual thesis project, see if it improves. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you're looking for a thesis coach, someone to offer guidance and feedback that is complementary to what you get from your expert supervisor, please visit www.professoreric.ca.